President, distinguished guests, it's a privilege for me to be here today, and doubly so because Professor Bichak has been a friend and colleague for 40 years, since the time when we were both young. And there are many benign changes since then. I met Jiří in America. Indeed, most scientists of our generation met their counterparts from the rest of Europe in the US. And this was true for those from Western Europe, as well as from countries behind the Iron Curtain. Now, in contrast, there's a vibrant interchange all across Europe, much helped by European Union schemes. And also in the big sciences, particle physics, astronomy and space, all Europe cooperates and thereby provides the best science in the world. This is all good news. And this is where academies and learned societies have a role, and will have still more in tomorrow's world. I'm going to be looking forward, but first, a short flashback to the 17th century. Britain's Academy of Science, the Royal Society, was founded in 1660. At their regular meetings, its fellows peered through newly invented microscopes, they heard travellers' tales, they experimented with air pumps, explosions and poisons. And some meetings were rather gruesome. Samuel Pepys recorded in his famous diary a blood transfusion from a sheep into a man. And the man amazingly survived. Well, health and safety rules render Royal Society meetings much duller these days. These 17th century men, and they were mainly men, I'm afraid, were ingenious and curious. But they were also immersed in the practical agenda of their era, improving navigation, exploring the New World, rebuilding London after the fire. They were politically inspired, as the professors mentioned, by Francis Bacon. They were, in Bacon's phrase, merchants of light, but committed also, in his other phrase, to the relief of man's estate. And they were already an international group. The Royal Society founded the first scientific journal, edited by a German, and it had in the early days papers from Huygens and other scientists in mainland Europe. Today's scientists have the same broad motives as these pioneers: the curiosity to probe nature's laws, the delight in ingenious devices, the aim to improve human lives. And their outlook is now even more international. But they can't now be polymaths. That's the big change. Research is now professionalized, arcane, technical, and specialized. So there's a communication barrier between scientists and the wide public. Indeed, between different specialities, too. Moreover, scientists are, in general, too disengaged from politics. And that's why societies that straddle these barriers that relate scientists to the rest of the world are more important than ever. By the way, I'm using science in the broad sense to encompass technology and engineering. This is not just to save words, but because they are symbiotically linked. Problem solving motivates us all, whether one is an astronomer probing the remote cosmos, or an engineer facing a down-to-earth design conundrum. And the latter is just as challenging. A point neatly made by an old cartoon, which all engineers like. The cartoon shows two beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. One beaver says, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." Moreover, science isn't just for scientists. It's crucial for an increasing range of careers. But it should impinge on everyone else. That's because all today's young people will live in a world ever more dependent on technology and ever more vulnerable to its failures and misdirections. Society already confronts questions like who should access the readout of our genetic code, how will longer lifespans affect society, should we build nuclear power stations or wind farms, should we plant GM crops, should the law allow designer babies or cognition-enhancing drugs. And these questions matter to us all. They involve science, but they involve economics, politics, and ethics as well, areas where scientists speak as citizens without special expertise. But democratic debates won't rise beyond slogans unless everyone, all citizens, have enough feel for science and for risk and uncertainty to prevent their being bamboozled by propaganda and bad statistics, and prevent them being over-deferential to experts. Scientists routinely bemoan how little the public knows about science. But I think they grumble too much. There is indeed widespread ignorance. Many people don't know the nation's history, couldn't find North Korea or Syria on a map. And this is an indictment of schooling in general, certainly in my country. I don't think scientists have a special reason to moan. In fact, I'm gratified and surprised that so many people are interested in dinosaurs, the Hubble telescope, the Higgs boson, all blazingly irrelevant to our day-to-day lives. But this leads to another reason why science education is important. Scientific insights are valuable for their own sake. In the 19th century, the ideas of Darwin and the geologists reached a broad public. Today, it's a real intellectual deprivation not to understand our natural environment and the principles that govern the biosphere and climate, and to be blind to the marvelous vision offered by Darwinism and modern cosmology, the chain of emergent complexity leading from a Big Bang to stars, planets, biospheres, and human brains able to ponder the wonder and the mystery. These concepts are highlights of human culture. Moreover, science is the one culture which is truly global. Protons, proteins, and Pythagoras are the same from China to Peru. It should transcend all barriers of nationality. And, by the way, it should straddle all faiths, too. The scientists who attack mainstream religion, rather than striving for peaceful coexistence with it, damage science and also weaken the alliance against fundamentalism and fanaticism. It's important that everyone realizes how much scientists still don't know, and to realize that commonplace phenomena are often the most perplexing. It may seem odd that astronomers can speak confidently about galaxies billions of light years away, whereas the gurus who pronounce on everyday matters like diet and childcare, which we all care about, change their advice from year to year, and you're foolish to believe them at all. But it isn't really so odd, because what makes things hard to understand isn't how big they are, it's how complex they are. And astronomy is, in a sense, a simple subject. It's easier to predict eclipses than to forecast the weather. And an insect, with its layer upon layer of complicated structure, is far more complex than a star. What breakthroughs can we expect in the future? In my own subject of astronomy, there's much excitement. For instance, retinues of planets orbiting other stars, discovered by a spacecraft fittingly named after Kepler. And I'll have a chance to talk more about this in my lecture this afternoon. So let me broaden my perspective now beyond science. What kind of world will today's young people be living in by mid-century? Well, they'll be in a more crowded world. We can predict that. 50 years ago, world population was below 3 billion. It's now over 7 billion, and by 2050, it's projected to be about 9 billion, the growth being mainly in the developing world. And another change, of course, is that the world's intellectual and physical capital will shift towards Asia, the end of 400 years of hegemony by Europe and North America. But as well as being more crowded, the world will have a changed climate, and that will add to the pressure. But despite this, 9 billion people can be fed, and my colleague Brian Heap will be talking more about this. And other advances, especially in healthcare and information technology, offer grounds for hope, even in a more crowded world. And we can predict something else. There'll be a growing gap between what science allows us to do and what it's prudent or ethical actually to do. Technology will offer amazing prospects, but it'll open up new threats and pose new ethical dilemmas. Some people worry that it's running away faster than we can cope with it. Our world is getting more interconnected. We depend on elaborate networks, electric power grids, air traffic control, international finance, and so forth. Unless these networks are highly resilient, their manifest benefits could be outweighed by catastrophic breakdowns cascading through the system. Pandemics can spread at the speed of jet aircraft, causing maximum havoc in the shambolic megacities of the developing world. Social media can spread psychic contagion, panic and rumors literally at the speed of light. These are big concerns. Indeed, malign or foolhardy individuals or small groups will have far more power and leverage than in the past. Concerns about cyber attacks by criminals and hostile nations is rising sharply. Advances in biotech, likewise, offer huge potential for medicine and agriculture, but they amplify the risk of bio-error or bioterror. Recently, some researchers who'd shown it was surprisingly easy to make the influenza virus both virulent and transmissible were pressured to redact some details of their publications. And the US government last October stopped funding these so-called gain-of-function experiments. Even more recently, there's been controversy about experiments done by Chinese scientists to edit the genetics of human embryos. These are just portents foreshadowing the ethical and prudential issues that will face us in the future. These concerns may arise not just in biotech, but in another fast advancing technology, robotics and machine intelligence. We're plainly witnessing momentous advances in the powers of machines to learn, to communicate, and to interact with us. They don't learn like we do. Computers use brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way a baby learns. They learn to translate from foreign languages by reading multilingual versions of millions of pages of, for instance, European Union documents. They never get bored. And there's been exciting advances in what's called generalized machine learning. DeepMind, a small London company just bought by Google for a huge sum of money, created a machine which can figure out, without being told, the rules of the old Atari computer games and then play them better than humans. advances in sensors and motor skills are still slower. Robots are still clumsy compared to a child in moving the pieces on a real chessboard. They can't tie your shoelaces or cut your toenails. But sensor technology, speech recognition, information searches and so forth are also advancing fast. And robots will take over a wider range of jobs. Not just manual work, indeed jobs like plumbing and gardening will be among the hardest to automate. But clerical jobs, routine legal work, and medical diagnostics and operations. And the big question is then, will robotics be like earlier disruptive technologies, the car, for instance, in creating as many new jobs as the old ones it's destroyed, or is it different this time? That's going to be a key social issue. And another ethical issue is the use of dumb autonomous robots and drones by the military. Can they be trusted to seek out a targeted individual via facial recognition and decide whether to fire their weapons? Who has the moral responsibility then? Another ethical issue. And that is a fairly near-term issue. Looking further ahead, how can we ensure that ever more sophisticated computers remain docile idiot savants and don't go rogue? If they could infiltrate the internet and the Internet of Things, they could manipulate the rest of the world in a chaotic way. Experts disagree on how long it'll take before machines achieve general-purpose, human-level intelligence. Some say 25 years, others say never. The median guess in a recent survey was about 50 years. And therefore, some experts in AI think the field already needs guidelines, just as biotech does. I want to close now with a few thoughts about the obligations of scientists and engineers when their investigations do have potential social, economic, and ethical impacts, which concern us all. It's important to keep clear water between science and policy. Risk assessment should be separate from risk management. Scientists should present policy options based on a consensus of expert opinion, but if they engage in advocacy, they should recognize that on the economic and ethical aspects of any policy, they're just citizens, not experts, and they'll have a variety of views. Nuclear power, for instance, is where all experts have different views. Sometimes there has been a constructive public debate. In Britain, a dialogue with parliamentarians led, despite diverse ethical stances, to a generally admired legal framework on embryos and stem cells, a contrast to what happened in America. But we've had failures too. In Europe, the GM crop debate was left too late, to a time when opinion was polarized between eco-campaigners on the one side and commercial interest on the other. Scientists do, however, have a special responsibility to engage, even though just as citizens. Some of the finest exemplars of responsible citizen scientists were found among the atomic scientists who developed the first nuclear weapons during World War II. Fate had assigned them a critical role in history. But many of them, great scientists like Joe Rotblat, Hans Bethe, and Rudolf Piles, who I was privileged to meet in their later years, they returned with relief to peacetime academic pursuits. But the ivory tower wasn't for them a sanctuary. They continued not just as academics, but as engaged citizens, promoting efforts to control the power they had helped unleash. And the same obligation applies to scientists now in biotech and computers. And a special obligation lies on those in academia and those who are self-employed entrepreneurs, because those groups have more freedom to engage in public debates than employees of government or industry. The biggest challenge, of course, is that most of the important issues facing the world involve science, but they're global and they're long-term. And many of them, energy and climate change, for instance, involve multi-decade timescales, far outside the comfort zone of most politicians, because they look to their own voters in their own country and only towards the next election. And in the commercial world, stockholders expect to pay off in the short run. So we need to widen our horizons in space and time to care about what happens in faraway countries and what happens to future generations. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning, and without a broader perspective, without realizing that we're all on this crowded world together, governments won't properly prioritize projects which are long-term in a political perspective, even for a mere instant in the history of our planet. So we need a change in priorities and perspectives if we are to navigate the challenges of the 21st century, if we are to share the benefits of globalization, to prioritize clean energy and sustainable agriculture, and to handle the Promethean challenges posed by ever more powerful technology. We'll need the idealistic and effective efforts of natural scientists, environmentalists, social scientists, and humanists. They must be guided by the insights that science can offer, but inspired by values which science itself can't provide. And I give my last word to a great British scientist, the biologist Peter Medawar. I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They are attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they don't make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rees, for your global view of spaceship Earth. So let me turn now to Professor Geoffrey Boulton to give his talk, and that will be on open data and future of science. Please, Professor Boulton.
Well, firstly, let me say it's an honor to be here in Prague, but also a great pleasure. The sunshine of Prague is far preferable to the wind and rain of Edinburgh. Now, my thesis is quite a simple one, and it is that openness to scrutiny of the evidence for scientific concepts has been the bedrock in which scientific progress has been built in the last 300 years. But it is also that the digital revolution that we have known in the last 2 decades both poses challenges to the maintenance of that principle, but also enormous opportunities for gaining new knowledge. And we must firstly respond to the challenge, and secondly, exploit the opportunity. But like Martin, it's often helpful to have a little history. And I go back to the same point in history that he chose, for rather obvious reasons, given where we come from, and that is back to the early years of the Royal Society, founded in the early 1660s. The first General Secretary, as Martin noted, was a man called Henry Oldenburg. Henry was a German theologian who was also an inveterate correspondent. He exchanged letters with people who we would now call scientists from all over Europe and indeed beyond. And Henry had a bright idea. that rather than keep his correspondence private, why not publish it? He persuaded the new society to do precisely that, and in 1664, 1665, the first edition, first volume of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London were printed, and indeed it's a frontline journal to the present day. But Henry had two requirements of his correspondence. Firstly, that they should correspond with him in the vernacular, not in Latin, which doesn't seem today to be a big deal, but in those days it was. But secondly, and absolutely crucially, he required that when they presented a concept, they should also present the evidence on which that concept was based. That step, insofar as there is a scientific method, that's it. To some degree, one might say Henry invented it. What it does is permit others to scrutinize, firstly, the logic of the relationship between the concept and the evidence, and secondly, to replicate the observations or the experiments on which that evidence is based. And historians of science have argued that those steps, the open publication of science, the connection between, the vital connection between concept and evidence, have been the workhorses of scientific progress and are the things which have underpinned the waves of scientific revolutions that have occurred from the 17th century onwards. But one problem is that the world has now changed somewhat. Arthur Koestler wrote about 20 years ago that the progress of science is like an ancient desert trail, littered with the decaying remains of discarded scientific theories that once seemed to have eternal life. What he was describing is what has been called the principle of self-correction, that science is good at finding out where we're wrong. But Henry Oldenburg's world and Arthur Koestler's world have changed. Over the last 2-3 decades, we have acquired new means of acquiring data on a massive scale, of storing it, of manipulating and analyzing it, and of course instantaneously transmitting it. It has created a veritable storm of data which has been growing dramatically over several years. And the great challenge is to observe the principles that Henry Oldenburg set out, providing the evidence that underpins the concept, in a world where there is big data. About 3 years ago, there was a paper published in Nature, produced by a US group, in which they analyzed or attempted to replicate the results of what they took to be the 50 top papers from the preceding decade in the field of preclinical oncology. And they found they were only able to replicate the results in 11% of cases. In 89% of cases, in a crucial area of modern medical science, they were unable to replicate the results. Well, why? There's been considerable analysis of what they did and what others have done since then, and the conclusions are quite simple. Some of them were based on fraud. Data had been invented. In other cases, the data, or the metadata, which is the data about data which permits you to use the data, had either not been presented or only partially presented, such that even if the conclusions were correct, there was no way in which others could independently verify that that was the case. And the third reason, and a very difficult issue at the present, is that the computer code, which permits you to analyze the data in the way the originators did, simply wasn't made available. And very frequently, of course, one needs to know about the machine on which the data has been analyzed. Now, these are very great problems, and they're problems that the regime of open data that many are advocating depend upon. So the challenge is, how do we maintain a regime in which we automatically present data to support the concepts that we wish to propose? It's a major problem. It has been picked up by the non-scientific world. 2 years ago, the cover of The Economist magazine had an image showing scientists at work and looking very puzzled, and the headline was, "Scientists like to believe that science is self-correcting. To a worrying degree, it is not." If that perception spreads in the world to which science attempts to contribute, then the very credibility of scientific research is undermined. This is a large problem and needs a major response. 3 years ago, the Royal Society produced a document on open data and open science. And what it argued was what we called intelligent openness. Now, who wouldn't wish to be intelligent? And we argued that published data must be published concurrently with the paper to which it referred. It should be accessible. You must be able to find it, get your hands on it. It must be comprehensible. You must be able to understand it. It must be accessible. You must be able to analyze how this was produced in an appropriate fashion. And it must be reusable. And only when the data is openly accessible in that form should it be regarded as properly open. Our view was that it should come to be regarded as scientific malpractice not to observe those strictures, and that the responsibility lies with professional organizations like this one, and particularly with scientific journals, not to be prepared to accept publications, proposals which don't involve the open accessibility of data. And that's the dark side, the problem that we have to confront. But of course, there's a positive side. There are great opportunities opened by the storm of data which seems sometimes to overwhelm us, so-called big data. And I'll give you 3 examples. One of them is that there are many domains now whereby integrating large quantities of data from many sources, we're able to resolve phenomena in nature which hitherto have been impossible to resolve. They were formerly below our horizon, and now we can observe that they are there. There are some dramatic advances, for instance, in genomic technologies which permit us to do this, but only through proper analysis are we able to reveal the real results that lie beneath them. Another example from the integration of data, the agrochemical company Monsanto, 2 years ago, bought up a company for $1 billion that has concentrated on the aggregation of climatic and meteorological data that influences farming technologies, soil infiltration, temperature, seasonality, and so on. And they argue that by integrating that with the often freely available data on soils that is present in many, many countries worldwide, it would permit them to assess and evaluate agricultural fertility into the future in ways that have not hitherto been possible. A major, potentially at least, a major advance in agriculture by understanding the relationship between climate, meteorology, and fertility. Crucially important in feeding a growing world. A third example is the accuracy of modern meteorological forecasts, weather forecasts. Within the last 10 years, they have improved enormously. I sail a boat on the ocean, and I know very well that they have improved greatly. The reason they've improved is quite simple. If you make a forecast, a meteorological forecast, you start with an initial condition of a distribution of temperature, of pressure, of circulation patterns. You then use the equations of motion to project forward that system, and let's say in 24 hours or 48 hours, you check your simulation with reality, which is continuously made available through modern sensors in many places, including from satellites. What inevitably you find is the prediction has strayed away from reality. So what do? You bring the prediction back to reality. And the program remembers how that was done. So the next time, it doesn't make the same mistake. And the consequence of that is that on a weekly basis, it's possible to predict pretty much how much sun is going to shine in Prague in the next 7 or 8 days. You may not believe it, but I can tell you it's true. This was predicted beautifully by Met records. There are, of course, major problems, and one of them has been alluded to by Martin, and that is the analyses of complex data sets requires machines to do it. The output from those machines often consists of equations which are, let's say, 50 components long. Much of the output from those machines is generally inaccessible to human cognition. And the question is, how do we take the output from machines that are trying to understand patterns in nature, and how do we ourselves understand them? How do we create the visual images that will permit us to do that? And in a sense, what is the role of the researcher and the scientist in a digital world? These are large problems to do with the way in which we work. Now, exploiting these opportunities of big data depend on openness. They depend on the readiness of those who have accumulated and acquired data to make it open to others. And that is not merely the data that underpins a research publication they may wish to make, but the data that may never be published too. Now you might say, why should I as a scientist give my data openly to others who might scoop me? I mean, I work in Antarctica. My work is a little more onerous in personal terms than someone working in a nice laboratory in Prague. Why should I, who've frozen, half frozen to death, and worked hard in those surroundings, give my data to others? The answer was given rather clearly to a meeting that I attended about 3 weeks ago in Cambridge. There is a European group of which the Czech Republic now is becoming a member called Elixir. They work in the domain of bioinformatics, attempting to understand genomic processes. And what Elixir does, it requires of its members that as soon as they have sequenced a biological phenomenon, the sequence should be automatically made available far in advance of any publication that is made. When I asked a young researcher 3 weeks ago in Cambridge, well, didn't this undercut their potential to build their career on publication? And the answer was no. Now that I'm a member of Elixir, I have an enormous corpus of data that's available to me. It's much more powerful than merely clutching my own data to my chest. And all I have to be is to be cleverer than the others. And at the same time, of course, such programs can provide support in software and advice to a whole community. So these processes are not imaginary processes. They're now being implemented in many fields of science, and in my view, inexorably they will spread. And it's important that here in the Czech Republic, you should, as we do in Britain, take these seriously as crucial parts of the underpinning that our research is going to require in the next few years. But of course, there are broader dimensions to all this. Some of you will be aware, many of you will be aware, of the phenomenon of citizen science, where ordinary citizens, many of whom have no scientific training, become involved in effectively large-scale scientific research. In astronomy, for example, programs like Galaxy Zoo incorporate ordinary citizens who are enthusiastic about being involved. My wife, every month, goes out to a stretch of woodland south of Edinburgh, and she monitors in her notebook. She's a letterist, she's not a scientist. She monitors in her notebook the dying back of ash trees. And that's because in Britain, we have a major problem. The ash tree species is dying in a very complicated way. The Department of the Environment in London, that ultimately feels it has responsibility to address this phenomenon, doesn't have the personnel to address it. And so they use something like 7,000 individuals across Britain to send back information. They integrate the information and play it back to those who've been involved in providing regional information. And what's more, they ask their correspondents and their contributors for their ideas about what might be done. It's a very interactive process. And in my view, that sort of thing has the potential to change in the longer term the social dynamics of science, which I think is a crucial phenomenon. Of course, at the same time, governments have been making available governmental data, public data about health, about a whole series of issues on which government collects data about their populations. The motivation mostly has been to stimulate commercial innovation, but at the same time, community groups have been using that information and engaging in a rather fundamental way. And of course, there's another domain which is becoming increasingly important. Our fellow citizens have lost many of the habits of deference that used to characterize them many years ago. Now, as a scientist, if you stand up and express your view about this or about that, and if this and that is related to features such as climate change, to the spread of infectious disease, to energy, then no longer are our fellow citizens content simply to listen to what we say and take it as the truth. They want to see the evidence as well, and so they should. So the openness of science towards our fellow citizens becomes crucial. If one goes into the private, the commercial domain, of course there are many sectors of commercial industry now where openness is a business model. There are many sectors where it's not. One of the questions we should ask is, if I'm going to implement a major new chemical facility in this location, should not those in the region have access to the safety case which determines the risks involved there? And equally, should we not have citizens have access to the data which has been so profoundly misused by the banks, impoverishing millions worldwide and enriching a few? There are some very, very large issues that spread beyond science about openness, technical openness, governmental openness, and the right of society to engage itself in those things. But there is also a potential dark side to all this, which some have identified, and that is the potential in a data-rich age where knowledge itself could become more and more privatized. There have been many moves towards openness of knowledge, open science, but equally there are powerful trends, underlying trends, which could be that knowledge itself becomes a rather closed box. And that's a very serious potential for the future. Ultimately, of course, all these things are about democracy. Science has, science is, science will continue to change the world we live in, and it's important that citizens should be aware of that science, and that science should be accessible to them. It's crucial that science is a public enterprise and not one that's conducted behind closed laboratory doors. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Boulton, for very democratic and very open views on the contemporary problems. And I would like now to turn to Professor Sir Brian Heap to talk on smart villages, is it now? Yes, smart villages development and science policy. Please, Professor Heap.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be here back in Prague again and on such a beautiful occasion, and thank you so much for the invitation. Today, 1.3 billion people live without electricity. That is, they live off the grid. And much is made of smart cities these days, but little is heard about smart villages. With 47% of the world's population and 70% of the world's poor living in rural communities, shifting the balance of opportunities between cities and villages is an intellectual and economic challenge which demands urgent attention. and in particular from the international community, not least in respect of migration and the growth of megacities. So what I thought I'd do in this short paper is to tell you about a new project which is underway, which is based on the idea of smart villages. Now, the concept of smart villages is that modern energy access acts as a catalyst for development, whether it's in education, in health, food, productive enterprise, environment, and participatory democracy. And that, in turn, leads to further improvements in energy access. As such, energy access can provide a much-needed driver for sustainable economic development and growth for this 1.3 billion people, which is a neglected sector of the world's economy and who live off-grid, as I mentioned, and they're often referred to as the underserved people in developing countries, who are reflected in a book by Paul Collier from Oxford, which I'm sure several of you will have seen, called The Bottom Billion. The significance of international development as we know it today was reflected in President Truman's inaugural address in 1949, when he said, "A bold new program for making the benefits of scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of undeveloped areas." And 6 decades later, the argument continues about international development and techno-utopian views, which are commonplace in today's high-tech world. Yes, there have been real improvements in the reduction in poverty and hunger. And this is indicated by some of the positive outcomes of the Millennium Development Goals recently completed. But there's still a very long way to go. The new Sustainable Development Goals, which we hope will be ratified in September this year, should help, but only if served by the combined and often elusive interactions of both the bottom-up and the top-down sectors of society. The Small Villages Initiative examines the use of access to energy as an entry point into development. On the supply side, it asks, what are the scientific and technological developments of today's and tomorrow's advances which could transform the way that energy, particularly electricity, could become a more realistic proposition for the poor in developing environments? On the demand side, it examines whether access to energy is adequately recognized as a catalytic agent for development in off-grid villages. So a key aim is to identify the framework conditions necessary to foster entrepreneurial initiatives to meet the off-grid energy challenge, and which ensure that government and donor funding achieve maximum leverage of private sector investment. An underlying premise is that activities to enable sustainable energy access need to be integrated with other development initiatives taking place at the community level to maximize social benefit and development impact. So we started with a scoping study in 2010, which was based on India and Tanzania. It was a preparatory phase undertaken to identify relevant research expertise and to make connections with policy and non-governmental organizations and major corporate sectors, all of whom have expressed a strong interest in the initiative. We held a forward look workshop earlier this year in Cambridge, aimed to identify potential game-changing technology developments that might occur over the next 10 to 15 years, to ensure that the ones that we were considering in this initiative are not going to be replaced by other successful disruptive technologies that are coming down the line. We held a pilot workshop in Arusha in Tanzania, late last year to look at the transformative effects of renewable energy, specifically on the ground, visiting off-grid villages to see what was actually happening. Then at the beginning of this year, we also held a graduates brainstorming forum, because one of the key issues here is to involve lively new brains who've got some bright ideas that can be brought to bear in terms of providing renewable energy in these situations, and who are conscious of the opportunities of energy as a catalyst for development. So the focus of this 3-year Smart Villages initiative is off-grid villages where local solutions are cheaper than national grid extension. And in many cases, national grid extension is totally impossible because of the remoteness of the villages. And among the technological solutions are solar photovoltaics, wind power, biomass, pico, micro, and macro mini-grids, hybrid combinations, energy storage, and the role of information and communication technology. An important concern will be in catalyzing rapid progression through the various levels of energy access, from home lighting right through to productive enterprises based in villages. So we plan 6 in-country workshops in Africa, Southeast Asia, India, and Latin America to provide a comparative bottom-up view of the challenges of village energy provision for development and how they can be overcome. The pilot workshop in Arusha that I mentioned was held with the Academy of Tanzania. It was followed by the official launch in Kuching in Sarawak with the Academy Sains Malaysia, the Malaysian Academy, and that was held in January this year. And both these 3-day workshops involved around 60 to 80 people and attracted participants from the neighboring countries, including Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda in East Africa, and Cambodia, Myanmar, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Singapore in Southeast Asia. Further workshops are in the planning stages, mostly in India for this year, and also Ghana towards the end of the year, and Bolivia and Mexico for Latin America in 2016. And each of the workshops is followed up by a program of engagement and dissemination activities which so far have taken place in Rwanda, in East Africa, and Nepal the week before the earthquake, which created some tragic situations. So the project aims to engage national academies and networks of academies, informing national, regional, and international policymakers and funding agencies. International experts in natural science and social sciences, engineering, and the humanities are working together with local and regional stakeholders such as entrepreneurs, villages, NGOs, financiers, and policymakers in the corporate sector. Collaborative work with key stakeholders ensures that the initiative is firmly rooted in addressing real-world issues and achieves effective uptake and impact. So the outputs of the project, which is supported by the Templeton World Charity Foundation in Nassau and the Cambridge Malaysian Education and Development Trust in Cambridge, the outputs will include 4 or 5 items. A series of accessible essays for policymakers, decision takers, academics, and the corporate sector. Secondly, policy briefs for academics to use with policymakers. Thirdly, a practical handbook for local and regional planners, and in this context, we have quite a number of young students who are working on the development of a policy handbook, which is going to be available for off-grid villages. Then we have an innovation competition for local entrepreneurs. The first will be based in Dar es Salaam this summer, and followed in India during the course of this year in collaboration with the Energy and Resources Institute in New Delhi, TERI, an excellent institute. And for the first part of this, which is being held in East Africa, we've had extraordinary response from over 100 young people. We have an age limit. They have to have not been out of college for more than 3 years, and they're asked to submit a bright idea that might be carried forward. So we have over 100 who've responded to that competition. The other output is that invitations to present at conferences like this and elsewhere. We are presenting in New York this week. We've had an invitation to present to the International Conference on Sustainable Energy. It's actually quite early in the time of this project. We're only 8 months into this project, but it seems to have caught the attention of a lot of people, and therefore they're asking us to give some interim reports. Next month, we go to the International Science Journalists Conference in Seoul at their invitation, and we also had an invitation to present to the European Commission. The European Commission is particularly important, as I'll come back to in a moment. So those are the immediate outputs. The outcomes will be to inform policymaking and initiatives through analysis of the interrelationships of energy provision and the capacity to create jobs and sustain employment, key steps towards the economics of escaping the poverty trap. So these will be for individual countries. It's going to be, we're working through the academies and we're seeking to encourage them to inform their policymakers. With the European Union, it's directed towards the policymakers in the Directorate General Development and Cooperation, directorates in energy, climate action, research and innovation, and we're in touch with all those directorates and have been asked to make presentations to them. At the regional level, it's going to be through the Africa Union in Addis Ababa and in the East Africa Community and their equivalents in other areas, and at a global level through UN bodies such as Sustainable Energy for All, SE for All, which Ban Ki-moon set up a short time ago, as well as the World Bank. So the final workshops at the end of this 3-year program will include the European Commission in Brussels, the Africa Union in Addis Ababa, and also probably Kuala Lumpur for Southeast Asia. And the aim is to bring together participants from previous workshops with experts, with policymakers, with funding agencies, and thought leaders. The purpose will be to distill key conclusions from the study and formulate advice to policymakers and other key stakeholders on strengthening the provision of sustainable energy off-grid, which for many years has been very low on the political agenda. So part of the purpose of this project is to raise the issue of off-grid energy and the provision to the 1.3 billion who live off-grid and for whom there is now an opportunity, particularly with the breakthrough technologies and especially the renewable technologies that are becoming available. I have a few handouts here, so I'll leave them near the door, so please help yourself, take them away. I don't need to take them home. Thank you very much.